You ever seen an albino with a birthmark on his face in the shape of an ink blot, but potentially suggestive of a, what am I getting at here? It kind of looks like a raven, right? It's like an ink block test. It's interesting. I don't know much about that test in psychology, but I think it has something to do with a shrink holding up pictures that are ink blots, and then the patient determines what they see, and depending on whatever they see, psychoanalysis is sort of, based on that, I guess, after the ink blot test or whatever. But anyway, this Bloodraven guy, let me give you a picture of him. He was albino, right? You ever seen an albino? I've seen them before. Actually, a bunch. There was a whole albino family near my grandma's house in Philly. Whenever we would go trick-or-treating, we would always stop by there on mischief night and see if the albinos could come out and play, because the kids were mean and they were like, look, they're already wearing their Halloween masks. But anyway, this dude Bloodraven had full albino characteristics and features in a medieval time, right? So in a medieval fantasy time that doesn't exist on Planetos, but you can relate to modern medieval. I gotta sneeze. That was nuts. But yeah, we could just relate to, um, you know, how we'll say superstitious medieval people were back in the day. Here, right? If if you were a woman and you could read, well, you were the devil, right? So just imagine, transferring over to Westeros. This guy is a great bastard, right? He not only has a bunch of power because of the station in which he was born, but also he has mystical abilities because his mother is a Blackwood. So he's literally half Targaryen, half blood of the dragon, and then also half blood of the First Men. That's really special, right? So not only does he look weird, but he also is weird in the sense that he's a magical being. But also get this, he was albino, so he was, his skin was very sensitive to light, and so was his eyes, so he would often wear a hood, right? That's kind of sketchy. This guy that can, the saying goes, he's got 1,000 eyes in one. He can be anywhere. If you talk shit about him, he'll know about it, and you'll be, subjected to torture or murdered, right? He also would wear darker clothes as well to help protect his skin. So he'd wear a hood, right? He's got red eyes. Well, he's got one red eye, wine-stained birthmark. He had two eyes at one point, but he lost it in the Blackfire Rebellions in a duel, right? But ultimately, all of that sort of adds to his mystique. And then you find out, right, when you read, the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, right? You basically find out that Bloodraven in his prime was pretty badass. Like, his two other brothers were bigger than he was and stronger than he was, but he was smarter, right? He, like, some of the rumors about him was that if you were an enemy of his, he would hunt you down with a pack of wolves. He would his mind would control a pack of wolves, and they would hunt you down. He's a warg. He would warg into a wolf pack. Probably not an entire wolf pack, just the leader, right? The alpha. Which actually is really interesting. I saw something yesterday about how alpha wolves is bullshit. Basically, all of those studies on alpha wolves and the way that a wolf pack works, like you have the alpha, then you have the beta, then you have all the way down to the omega, the bitchiest version of the wolf clan, the smallest, the lowest member, right? That's all bullshit. Because when they did those studies based on wolves in captivity, when they did those same studies on wolves out in the wild, that shit doesn't exist. The alpha wolf is the dad. And when the younger wolves, the sons, right, his sons, want to make their own pack, they just fucking leave and go do that, right? So there's no actual alpha wolf. It's kind of crazy. That shit, the concept blew my fucking mind, right? But in George's world, Bloodraven would get these, people would often build up his rep, but literally he would warg a wolf and track down his enemies. Anybody who was talking shit against, the crown. It's also interesting because we know that Bloodraven, you know, in the Mystery Knight, which is the third novella in the Night of the Seven Kingdoms, they're just like a series of short stories. It's actually right here. That was written by George in the world that's set about 100 years before the main events of the story. Bloodraven is still alive. Bran meets him at a cave. So is Aemon. Aemon at the wall. Maester Aemon is alive during this story. Walder Frey is like a 6-year-old little boy at one of the tourneys, right? So there's a few characters that are still alive. Ultimately, we don't know the fates of a lot of the characters in the story, so some of them that may come out later, like supposedly Sir Duncan the Tall eventually goes to Winterfell, and Hodor is related to him through Old Nan. Also, Brienne of Tarth is confirmed to be related to Sir Duncan the Tall. But anyway, the mystique and all this stuff is built up about this dude, Bloodraven. Ultimately, you kind of hear about him in his prime. He kind of, like, the idea that he can use a glamour, that he may have been potentially trained by the Faceless Men, is propositioned because he's basically this dude Maynard Plum in disguise the whole time. Basically, let me start at the beginning. All right, so going over my notes here. All right, so here we go. I actually started doing research based on the premise, the theory that I wanted to discuss, which was that the reason why the dragons are dying out isn't because necessarily magic is dying out, but maybe this is just random, and I promise you it'll relate to Bloodraven. Maybe because it got me thinking, right? So I have this theory where I talk about dragon breeding, right? How Targaryens are just a house of Valyrians, right? Valyrians would choose specific dragons and then sort of hone and focus those features by selectively breeding them with other dragons with similar features. All the time that I spent thinking about the theory, never thought about the something that like just throws sand all over that fire, and it's that, well, dragons don't technically mate, right? Dragons don't really have sex. I never really thought about that. I can't believe I never thought about that. They're asexual. They produce when they need to. So how could Valyrian... My theory about dragon breeding is bullshit. How... It doesn't even work. Like, it wouldn't work unless they did mate. And that's what I was saying. Maybe part of the reasons why they died out is because so many of the dragons died, right? They can only mate with certain types. I don't know. It was silly. But that led me into, like, oh yeah, they could be dying off, like how in Bran's chapters when he's with Mira Reed, and they're basically talking, when Bran is still at Winterfell, and he's asking Maester Luwin sort of like, where are the children of the forest? What happened to the giants and all that stuff? And, Maester Luwin says they simply died out. Times change, right? And then we find out with Jon, when he's north of the wall, he sees giants, right? And he thinks about how some stories said that these giants were massive sized, and the giants that Jon Snow's currently looking at are like half the size of that. And they're not as necessarily great as the legends say. Maybe those legends didn't lie. Maybe giants are just dying out, right? Children of the Forest are dying out. Magic is dying out. Dragons eventually died out. What if that's somehow all tied in? I don't know. But the Bloodraven part comes from, we got to realize we see him in action, or we read him in action in the Mystery Knight, right? And Night of the Seven Kingdoms, that novella, but then we don't hear about him at all in the main story, aside from him touching in Bran's dreams. And then eventually when we meet this character Euron, the symbology is there that he pretty much probably touched his dreams as well. What's interesting is that Bran obviously journeys north of the wall to try to get to his cave. When they get outside of his cave, Cold Hands sort of says, like, look, it's about 1,000 yards from here to the top of that hill. When you get to the top of that hill, there's a cleft in the rock. Go in there. That's where Bloodraven is, right? Or Three-Eyed Crow. So they do this. Like, they all start venturing up the little hill to go into Bloodraven's cave. What's interesting is that Cold Hands doesn't go. Cold Hands is like, the cave is warded. I can't get into the cave. And he starts fighting off the dead because the dead start attacking, Bran and Mira and Hodor and Jojen as they're climbing up the hill. So in this instance, Bran ends up warging into Hodor for the first time, right? Hodor is, Bran is attacked. He's, sort of sprawled out on the ground. Bran is handicapped, so he can't walk, right? And he, basically doesn't even realize he's doing it. He just does it. For, one instance, he hears Hodor crying and whimpering, and then the next moment, he's in Hodor, 7 feet of fury, swinging around. Now, what's interesting is that, if I'm not mistaken, no one, aside from Bloodraven, because he probably knows, no one really knew that was Bran inside of Hodor, because Bran, I don't know if he intentionally does it, or does it as just sort of because he doesn't have maybe full control over Hodor, but Bran starts saying Hodor, that's his rallying call. When Arya is being attacked at that castle aside the God's Eye, and she yells for Winterfell when she's killing Amory Lorch's men. This is what Bran does in Hodor's body when he's smashing up the whites. George has a really dope description. He's like, Bran is 7 feet tall. He's got a old iron in his hand, and he's chopping and swinging. That's not verbatim what it says, but it's just a really cool mental image that you get when you're reading it, right? So he says, Hodor, Hodor, and then he even starts to communicate with the entirety of the group by standing after he killed one of the whites. He stands up and just sort of points, and he's like, Hodor, basically telling everybody, rally up, let's continue up the hill. What's interesting is that he's then attacked, and then Bran passes out and wakes up next to a fire inside Bloodraven's cave. So they do make it in there, right? But right before that happens, Leaf shows up, right? So they're actually about to die, and up until Leaf shows up, they're kind of lost, right? Because they're being overwhelmed. So even though Bran does rally everybody, and he wargs into Hodor's body, ultimately it was fruitless because it's not enough to defeat the whites. They just keep coming back. But then out of nowhere, Bran sort of sees this tiny creature moving very quickly with a torch, and that creature is Leaf. We find out it's Child of the Forest, is running back and forth between all the whites, lighting them on fire. Now, what's interesting is that I haven't really mentioned this before, but Children of the Forest, they're squirrel peoples, what the giants called them. There's heavily reference to just a lot of squirrels, basically, the movement, just how quick they are. And then when Leaf refers to herself, why the giants called them that, she said, we move very quickly. So it just made me think of, in Dune, right? There's this character, Miles Teg, who's basically a Bashar, Dune right behind me, right? He's a member of House Atreides, but he's also part of a descendant of a Sardaukar army, because he's a Bashar, right? But the Atreides gene has been genetically sequenced in thousands, millions of individuals spread out throughout the entirety of the Dune universe, right? And this one dude, Miles Teg, develops this ability of super speed, and the description of it is really badass. But it just reminds me, or made me think of oh yeah, Children of the Forest probably can move. They're not just tiny creatures that can live for a while. They can probably move way faster than normal individuals. So that's one interesting thing that I haven't really talked about, is that the Children of the Forest are speedsters. If you watch Marvel, or if you read comic books, a speedster is somebody who can move super quick, like Quicksilver. This probably, I'll make one more point, then I gotta pause this, because I gotta go take a huge shit. This was really early in the morning, and that's when I take my poops. Children of the Forest can move very fast, not necessarily like squirrels, faster than squirrels. They sort of twitch, right? So Leaf does her twitch speed and kills all the whites, and then they enter the cave. Now, what's interesting is that Bran, as soon as he sees this little creature, he goes, oh my god, it's fucking Arya. Literally, Bran thinks to himself, holy shit, that's Arya. Even though he knew subconsciously that his sister was thousands of leagues away or dead, he goes, holy fuck, Arya's fucking here, and she's fucking shit up, right? So, Bran is full on convinced. He's like, holy shit, that looks like Arya, right? Even though he knows, like I said, Arya is either dead or 1,000 leagues away. He knows she's 1,000 leagues away, but he also thinks she could be dead. His gut instinct is telling her that he's still alive, and he's right. She is. She's 1,000 leagues away in Bravos, right? But anyway, Arya, is Arya underfoot. She moves quickly. So you could say that that's why Bran thought that the Child of the Forest was, his sister. But I think it's more physical features, too. All of Ned Stark's children embody some sort of old god. Like Arya's Child of the Forest, she's eventually going to learn, or she's learning the ways of the Faceless Men. So she's becoming a servant of the old gods. Bran is currently an avatar of the old gods, learning from Bloodraven, right? Bloodraven has the same blood as Bran because they're both blood of the first men. Bran is just missing the dragon blood, but we may find out something different. All right, let me go poop. All right, so getting back on track here. Let me actually tell you just to reorganize my brain, let me actually tell you the point, like the heart of the theory, and then I'll try to explain the branches of it, right? Or the arteries and veins going into it. So, like, if each one of Ned Stark's kids are, not each one of them, right? So Rickon and Sansa don't really count. But Bran, Arya, and Jon, right? Jon's not really Ned's children, but for this to work, right, there's 3 parts that George, I think, uses a lot, right? So you have the raven, the wolf, and then you also have, like, death itself. So the only thing certain in life is death, right? And then the raven and the wolf. Well, the raven is usually, interchangeable sometimes with the crow, the mind's eye, the 3-eyed crow, right? So that's the mind. And then, the wolf would be the body. So death would actually be the hand, right? So, we've got a lot of symbology with George's work with Hand of the King, and Jon's sword hand twitches. A lot of characters' fingers twitch, their sword hand, it's kind of related. So you have the hand, the body, and the mind, right? The hand acts on what the body and the mind want. So Bran would obviously be in that. This is kind of like just, to tie these 3 characters in together. Bran would be the mind. He would be the raven, right? The mind's eye. He sort of predicts the future based on past events and then sends messages for the hand to act. So eventually in the story, Bran will be king and will, interact with Arya through dreams, send her messages, and she will act on his behalf. And then you have Jon, who's the heart, right? So Jon just got killed. When he gets brought back, he could technically become a vessel for it, but he's more of like the moral standpoint of the character. Jon will always do what he thinks is right. Arya is delivering the gift of death, and Bran is becoming the overall mind. The raven, the wolf, the body, the hand. The raven, the wolf, the hand. I should come up with like a video theory version of this. I probably will. I'll condense it down. But this is literally my brainstorming process. There's a tiny little spring down here on the ground, and I don't know what it's from. That was a piece of poop. Just kidding. So, Arya is kind of relating back to what I was saying earlier. Arya probably has a strong amount of Children of the Forest DNA in her, which is why she sort of looks like Leaf, this child of the forest who Bran finds out was alive for 200 years. Like Leaf says, I was born during the time of the dragon. And she says, I walked the world, I did this, I did that, but eventually she went north and ended up in Bloodraven's cave. So that's really interesting. Leaf, this character, this child of the forest, was born, I would assume, 200 years ago during the time of the dragon, right? It's about 300 AC in the story, so she was born about 30 years before the events of House of the Dragon. So 30 years before, right? Get this. The Dance of Dragons happens. That's really interesting. This kind of relates to House of the Dragon itself if Kondo wants to go that route. Like, obviously we've already gotten past that point in the story, but it's possible that this Child of the Forest character, Leaf, could be perhaps referenced. Like maybe, there's definitely characters that could have potentially seen Leaf that are still alive. Like Leaf is on her journey, as a Child of the Forest. Maybe there's certain, like maybe, I don't think this is tinfoil. Put your cap on. Put your tinfoil cap on. But maybe Leaf is Alice Rivers. Leaf, born during the time of the dragon, helped heal, Daemon. Well, that didn't actually happen in the books. That's the casting leak that Alice Rivers supposedly healed Daemon, because Daemon takes Harrenhal without spilling any blood. He just takes Caraxes and lands on the top of the King's Tower, and then, goes to the Castellan, and is like, yo, dude, fucking surrender. Nobody will die. And that's actually, gives Daemon some, makes him look good, because he ultimately doesn't shed any blood. And this was still pretty early in the war. Like, he takes Harrenhal before Lucerys dies. But that obviously didn't happen in the TV show. But it's possible that Leaf is this Alice Rivers character. Hear me out. Alice Rivers is not described small at all, but, it's possible that because she didn't really age, and Children of the Forest aged extremely slow, it's possible. Maybe Children of the Forest have some natural ability to sort of face change, or like a natural glamour where they can, sort of project how they want to appear to people who aren't necessarily have trained eyes. Like the faceless men are trained to spot glamours. Learned individuals and other individuals can do this as well, but the average person can't necessarily look through a glamour. They have to sort of be trained to know what to look for, right? Now, what's interesting is that Bran, remember Bran sort of passes out right after Leaf comes and saves them, and then he wakes up next to a fire. And then when Bran comes back to consciousness, it's interesting because when Leaf talks, Bran thinks of... Wait, no, that's Jon with Melisandre. When Melisandre talks, Jon thinks of cinnamon and nutmeg and home and Winterfell. Like her voice is when she's about to burn Lord of the Bones, who's pretending, right, being glamored to be Mance Rayder. So Mance Rayder is pretending to be Lord of the Bones. So Mance Rayder survives, but they want to burn Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall. Stannis does. So Melisandre has to glamour Lord of Bones to look like Mance Rayder. But anyway, she gives this speech right before they burn Mance Rayder, and Jon, it's from his POV, he's like, oh man, her voice is so fucking sweet. Like, he just thinks like, oh, nutmeg and cloves and home. Like, she's probably got some sort of vocal glamour going on. She's like seducing and transfixing everyone. The Bene Gesserit kind of do this with this thing called the voice in Dune, right? So the Bene Gesserit can use this ability called voice to mainly control people to do what they want to do, right? It's not really mentioned all that much past the first Dune book, and then it sort of comes back in Frank Herbert's later books, but Chapter House and, obviously Heretics of Dune, but it's kind of like, it makes me think that there's multiple different ways to sort of glamour someone. But getting back on track here, Bran, even when he comes to after the big fight, he still cannot believe how much, Leaf looks like Arya. Now, what's interesting is that when they enter the cave, right, there's this light, like they have to go deep down. And eventually, when they get to actual Bloodraven, I can't believe I missed this. This is insanely embarrassing. And this is why I have read the book 7 times. Bloodraven, I knew it, but I didn't actually catch it. Bloodraven has a fucking glass candle, right? So, at the end of A Feast for Crows, when Sam meets Marwyn, Sam sees a glass candle. And Sam is such a smart individual. George was a genius for allowing us to witness a glass candle through Sam's POV, because Sam is the most observant person ever. So, Sam sees the glass candle, and it, like, first it's this color, then it's that color, and then it washes everything away. And, like, that, it's beautiful, right? I mean, like, Sam will hopefully eventually get to figure out, or not figure out, but get to see more of them, and we'll get to find out more of how they may potentially work. But Bloodraven has one, and it's lit when Bran first enters his cavern. Not like, remember, the top of the cave, they have to go down, deep down into it. And it while they're walking down, Hodor and Bran start to freak out a little bit because they see these, what they think are grave worms, white fleshy worms that sort of, are digging around in the earth. And Bran thinks for a split second, did we stumble into a cave of fucking grave worms? But then they realize, oh shit, no, it's weirwood roots, right? So they're making their way deeper down, right? And they eventually come to the outskirts of where Bloodraven's throne is, his weirwood throne of roots, right? But right before they do that, Bran sees this clear light. The light is red, and then it's ultimately super bright, and then everything turns black and white. This is the candle sort of deactivating. So Bloodraven was probably in a dream, or influencing others in their dreams, mainly Daenerys. Not too long before then, not too long after that, Daenerys is visited by Quaithe. And there's a lot of people that say Quaithe is potentially Sheer Seastar and this and that. Quaithe is just someone that Bloodraven is controlled from afar, either a willing person or a victim or maybe a complete glamour, right? And Quaithe is an agent of Bloodraven. Like, could be Sheer Seastar. Sheer Seastar is Bloodraven's one true love. But if Bloodraven is in the shape that he's in after 200 years, Sheer Seastar is probably in a similar shape. So maybe she has a glamour, and that mask that she wears is all a part of that glamour. And she's really this old, decrepit woman, like Melisandre, how you see Melisandre in the Game of Thrones TV show. And then I think George kind of hints at it in the books that Melisandre's far older than she appears because she has these red eyes. And all the characters with these red eyes, whether it be Bloodraven, Albino, or Ginny of Oldstones, who's potentially the old Child of the Forest Woods Witch bitch who's living inside Hollow Hill, right? Potentially John's direwolf ghost, has blood red eyes, right? So characters that have some significance to it. So Melisandre does have some significance to her because of her blood red eyes. But ultimately, the glass candle, when it's being used, when Bran first comes upon Lord Bloodraven, is he's influencing Daenerys' dreams, and he sends Sheer Seastar or Quaithe, whoever, right? It's Quaithe, but it could be, I'm saying, secret identity of Sheer Seastar, whoever, right? To go and visit Daenerys when Daenerys is sort of restless. She's in Meereen, and she's being kept up all night because, her freedmen and her Unsullied are being murdered by the Sons of the Harpy and, the slave masters in Meereen, right? So she's being just stressed out all the fucking time. She can't sleep. Then eventually, Missandei can't sleep either, so she soothes Missandei, but then she's still restless, so she goes into this bath and just sort of nods out for a second, and as soon as she nods out, she hears someone. Quaithe pops up and says, to go east, you must go west, and to go to that, right? That's not the point. But it's interesting because those chapters sort of line up perfectly with, like, hey, that's what Bloodraven's influencing Daenerys' dreams, because Daenerys will eventually bring dragons to Westeros. Bran will eventually org a dragon, and maybe that will be his mount. Maybe he could eventually not just warg the dragon, but ride the dragon via warging, right? And maybe Bloodraven could potentially bestow some sort of his essence onto Bran, and the reason why the dragon would bond willingly with Bran is because it can detect that essence of Bloodraven inside of Bran. Now, I know that's really, really, really crazy, but it's actually not. Wargs consume other wargs, and this is how they get more powerful. Like, Bloodraven ate all of his archers that went with him north of the wall. That's with all those skulls and all of the bones and stuff. Like, so Bran sees 6 skulls, half a dozen skulls, and then also half a dozen giant skulls. Those are Bloodraven's archers, the Raven's Teeth archer, who were also wargs. So Bloodraven wasn't naturally that powerful. Like, he was really powerful, but he became more powerful from consuming his Raven's Teeth archer, who went with him north of the wall when Egg, the little boy in the Dunk and Egg stories, becomes king and banishes him because he ends up committing treason, right? So it'll be really interesting to see. Like, that's pretty much the I think the main thing behind it. Like, people will say that he's evil and all this stuff, and it's like just kind of just like, you gotta do the research. Like, what we think is evil may not necessarily be evil to wargs in that society, because that's how they... It's like the Targaryens being incestuous. That's how they keep their powers to themselves. They basically mate with one another, right? So wargs kind of have to consume another to keep that power and that trait going. All right, now the last thing I want to mention for this episode of the podcast, hopefully you enjoyed it. Thank you so much to everybody. Y'all rock. Like, without Patreon, kind of wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing right now, because I don't make anything from YouTube. So, but yeah, thank you all so much. The last thing I wanted to mention for this was, kind of teased it a little bit earlier, was Bloodraven, and, his connection with Euron, right? So, similarity, Bloodraven lost an eye in a duel with Bittersteel, if I'm not mistaken. Euron lost his eye, but the incident that causes him to lose his eye surprisingly hasn't been mentioned, right? When Bran first meets Bloodraven, he says to him, "I saw your first steps, Bran. I saw you do this. I saw you when you would cry." He's been watching Bran his entire life. So when, Bran first meets him, it's kind of funny. It's the first thing Bran says is, "Can you fix my legs, man? My legs, they don't work. My legs, they're no good." And he's like, "No, that's beyond my power." And then Bran immediately goes, "Fuck." He goes, "We came all this goddamn way and you can't even fix me fucking legs, man. What the fuck, man?" Right? But then he does this whole spiel. He's like, "Bran, I watched your first steps. I watched you do this. I watched you do that. But you will never walk again, but you will fly." Right? So this sounds like something he's told somebody before, right? He told the same shit to Euron. He's like, "Euron, I've seen you pee. I seen you do this. I seen you do that." Now, there's a theory that the reason why Euron lost his eye is because he has grayscale, survived grayscale, but he lost the eye to grayscale. I like that. That's kind of cool. But this is my theory, right? So basically, Bloodraven gives that spiel to him, and then eventually, Euron comes north of the wall. It's one of Euron's first journeys. It's my theory. I think Euron may have potentially visited Bloodraven's cave. And when he got there, because initially I said Bloodraven, like everybody knows that Euron for sure is a former pupil of Bloodraven, right? But I think, or used to think, that Bloodraven just looked down Euron's future, saw what Euron would become, and was like, "Nah, fuck it. I gotta ditch this dude. He's pure evil. Fuck that guy. He's too evil for me," right? Now that kind of works, but doesn't make sense in a larger context of someone who can see someone's entire life. Clearly, he would know right the fuck away Euron's not the dude to fuck with, right? What if, when Bloodraven first looked at Euron was it? He didn't have that massive dark path in front of him. He didn't necessarily have full potential to become this evil overlord, great, basically direct enemy of, R'hllor, the Lord of Light, or the Northern Gods, a direct sort of, enemy of that, right? What if he didn't fuck up in the sense that he chose the wrong person? No, initially Euron was going to be what Bran has become, but in that journey to the cave is when things change, right? So Euron potentially makes that journey, right? Probably has some companions with him. Ultimately, he loses his eye on that journey, right? And then he finally does make it to Bloodraven's cave. Bloodraven gives him that spiel. "I've seen you this, I've seen you that." Euron, the type of person that he is, probably says some shit like, "If you saw that happening, why didn't you tell me about it?" Or maybe he says the same thing Bran does. "Can you fix my eye?" Right? Maybe that's part of the whole reason why Euron goes to the cave, is because his eye is fucked up. So maybe instead of him losing it as a result of the trip to the wall, he loses it as a child, and that's part of the reason part of the reason why his visions or his potential as a warg is unlocked, because he loses an eye and then his third eye sort of opens. Bran loses his legs and then his third eye sort of opens. And that journey that leads him to Bloodraven is Bloodraven can fix his eye. And then Bloodraven tells him, that's beyond my powers, but you'll be able to see better, far better than you've ever seen before in your entire life. And Euron, the type of person he is, was like, fuck that. I came all this way and you can't even fix my goddamn eye. And then they get into falling out. And then eventually Euron goes about this dark path and becomes a great direct enemy of Bloodraven, potentially Bran, and everything they represent, the deity they represent. And then Euron gets eventually possessed by Cthulhu, or, the Squisher King. That's a good point to wrap this video up. A nice little dose of tinfoil. I hope you all have a lovely, lovely Friday, or whenever I get this out, potentially Sunday. So yeah, thank you for watching and listening. Along that,